Welcome again and good evening. My name is Amy and I'm the Public Programs Manager from the New York Transit Museum. If you haven't been to the museum, it's really a great space to visit. We are located in downtown Brooklyn in a decommissioned I&D subway station. You're going to see some of it later on in the presentation, which I'm very excited about. We are open now from Thursday to Sundays, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can reserve tickets on our website. We also have a gallery and a shop in Grand Central Terminal. So for today's program, captions have been enabled. To view them, you just go to the 3 dots or captions at the bottom of your screen and click Show Captions. Also, we will leave time for questions at the end, so feel free to add them to the chat whenever, and I will share them out at the end of the presentation. So I'm very pleased to introduce our presenters for today, Deborah Lafer and Kim Hertz. Deborah is full professor of civil and urban engineering at New York University Center for Urban Science and Progress. Her background spans geotechnical and structural engineering and art history and historic preservation, wide range. She has authored over 200 peer-reviewed publications and been awarded 5 patents, and her work has been featured in Forbes, National Geographic, and TechCrunch. She's received many awards and honors from professional scientific societies. Kim Hertz is a PhD student in the Urban Systems program at NYU, and she's exploring the integration and implementation of technology within communities through human-centered design. Kim is leading the project's community-based digital twin in Sunset Park. So now I'll hand it over to Deborah and Kim.
Great, thank you so much. So in the spirit of a decommissioned facility, we are in a stairwell. So we thought that would be kind of a fun place to be. No, we lost our classroom tonight, so but we're here and we're delighted to be here. And it's so great to be able to talk to people who love the things we do, the things that are underground, the things the subway. And I hope we can provide kind of an expanded perspective for you today on maybe what's going on down there. So the main topics we're going to chat about are things about infrastructure management limitations, abandoned infrastructure, and new tech. So many of you have heard this term smart city. So certainly last year, it probably kind of came across your ears. You might know that a decade ago, you would have heard it too. And even a decade before, and a decade before that. This term was first brought in 1992. So are our cities today smarter than they were in 1992? Certainly there are aspects of them. We know when the train's going to come. We know when the buses are going to come. Your councilman may be able to see on a live dashboard which streets in the neighborhood have been plowed for snow. But our cities still are not that smart. We still suffer from a lot of challenges. So why is this? Why are our cities not smart? So, and today, the idea behind the smart city was to create what they call a digital twin, which was to put together technology of monitoring the city and being able to adapt accordingly. And today we've got robust, cheap, small wireless sensors, edge computing, which is where you're doing the computation at the sensor and you're not sending all the data over the web. Everybody knows about the cloud. And then these things called machine learning, deep learning, kind of new ways to look at data, find patterns in it. And we have very dense remote sensing. So here's some work that I did. It was taken from a helicopter, and this is what they call a point cloud. So it's capturing the geometric representation. This is a part of Dublin, and you can see the elevated train coming through the center. So why are cities not so smart? Well, I have 2 theories on this. One, that it lacks domain expertise. And 2, that it considers only half the problem. So we'll come back to this. So you never know what's underneath. So when you talk about lacking domain expertise, if I were to ask you to draw a sidewalk, you might draw something like this, fairly straight, fairly same in dimension, quite flat. And the question then becomes, is this realistic? Well, if you go outside, you know it's not. Our sidewalks are much more complicated places. They're not beautiful like this picture. They're filled with all sorts of different materials, different conditions. Well, why would this be important? Well, if I put a little robot and I wanted to go down the street to clean the street, and I told it that the sidewalk looked at the thing in the top left, we would probably have a very unhappy robot. And the same thing with digital twins. If you create a system that is too perfect and too idealized and doesn't really reflect the complexity of our urban places, this is what we get, things that are not fully functional. So above ground, these problems are not so difficult. And we have examples of lots of things that are monitored or could easily be monitored. Traffic signage, parking meters, walk signs, all sorts of things. And these provide a lot of the things that cities do in terms of public transportation and flood control and trash, collection and fire response. When we get to the underground, it's not so complete. We really don't know what's there. Many people might think, like a body, that everything is in the right place. There's a certain set of locations and organizations to it. And we worked with on this project that I'm going to talk about tonight with a wonderful artist named Emily Clark. And she came up with this concept that, to help people understand that cities are not like bodies, that the circulatory system, you may think, oh, a subway is a circulatory system. And therefore we know where all the pieces are. And, this happens when you know where the kidney is and the liver and all of these things. But the underground is not so simple. And I'm going to share a short video that our artist Emily Clark made for us as part of the outreach part of this project.
A little over 20,000 years ago, the huge Laurentide ice sheet reached Brooklyn and began to form its geology. Then, as the southern end of the glacier began to melt a few thousand years later, it left boulders, rock mounds, small lakes, ponds, streams, and marshes. These still existing waterways can fill up during extreme weather and penetrate the subway's tunnels and stations. On an average day, the subway pumps 13 million gallons of water into the city's sewage system. But when there's an excess of rain, the storm sewers back up. If climate change continues to fuel sea level rise and extreme weather, New York City's subway system will be increasingly vulnerable. During Hurricane Sandy, 46 miles of track were underwater. Begun in 1904, New York's subway has grown with the city's population and now includes 22 lines, 472 stations, and 665 miles of tracks for trains that, before COVID, carried about 5 million passengers a day. This subway station goes back to 1915. Imagine New York City as a massive human body. The subways would be like our circulatory system, its arteries and veins allowing its blood, our population, to move throughout. Like the body, the subway depends upon many parts, trains, tunnels and bridges, all embedded in the urban infrastructure of drainage, sewage, and electrical power sources. Beyond all this, there is the natural world of rain and snow and of heat waves and cold fronts, which also impact the system. We may think of the subway as independent, but we can never extract it from the streets above it, the building foundations next to it, the utility manholes and pipes that run through it, and the sewage and drinking water systems that interpenetrate it. Possible train routes were first determined by man-made underground infrastructure, but they were also planned in relation to geology, springs, and subterranean waterways. The subway's tunnels cannot help but overlap with the pathways of underground water, especially during storms. If the city is an organism in which the subway lives, the complexity of this organism itself already presents challenges. But the larger problem now is that this organism must also remain in harmony with the increasingly unpredictable environment around it.
So I think it really gives us a wonderful quick snapshot of our city and the things that lie beneath it. And when we do an excavation, unfortunately, what we see is not a nice segregated set of services like you might see on the right, but you get this spaghetti problem. And everything kind of gets buried into these common trenches. And this becomes problematic particularly when we overlay all of this with the forgotten functions of the city. In many parts of New York, when you walk down the street, there are things that are happening beneath you that you might not be realizing. You might not be aware of: hollow sidewalks, basement access routes, coal vaults, things that maybe have outlived their service life, but they're still there. The sad truth is, once something goes in the ground, we rarely take it out. Across New York City, there are bank vaults, utility vaults, all sorts of kind of secret vaults, things like this that you might accidentally stumble upon, particularly if you were trying to do construction. There are also forgotten land uses. Many people may not realize that at the time that Europeans first came to Manhattan, almost immediately after they first came to Brooklyn. And so we're all quite familiar with the tip of Manhattan and all of the settlement that happened there. But the circle on the bottom right portion is the same equivalent to the Brooklyn settlement where the colonists were. When we look on the left, if we just Google cemeteries, we will see that we have traces of many cemeteries still in Manhattan. None of these are documented in Brooklyn. I am sure that these cemeteries existed and they've just been lost to our records until, unfortunately, one day we do excavation and construction work. There are also the underground rivers. If you're fortunate enough to be in Manhattan on a quiet Sunday morning over at 6th Avenue and Minetta Lane, you will hear the river run underneath your feet. One of the things I think we have little appreciation of is how our infrastructure and services have changed over the years. Traditionally, people got their water near their house. They pumped it, they had wells. What happened to all these wells? Some of them, like this one shown in Queens, was incorporated into the city's water system, but many were not. Today we have the Croton Aqueduct. This was brought in quite early into New York City. These are major tunnels that run beneath us, our feet, and sit surprisingly close to many of our subway lines. What about sewage? Obviously, initially people just had privies in their backyard. You might be surprised to see this map from 1902 that shows all of the sewer lines already laid in Brooklyn. So much of our infrastructure is quite old. Gas and electricity were brought into the New York City, and steam as well, in 1823. This is an ad from 1850 showing that you could come to dance halls, come to bowling alleys, all sorts of things, and there would be gas lighting. So we often think of these kind of modern conveniences as kind of something that started happening in the 1900s, but much of this was already deeply in play here in New York City a good half a century before. Our steam lines, something quite unique to New York City, 100,000 buildings on steam, over 105 miles of pipe. Here's an early map of the steam lines, and they still cause us problems today. Interestingly, they cause us problems not only when they explode, but because they're often sitting next to other utilities. For instance, if you have telecommunication lines that are sitting too close to these steam lines, it tends to actually degrade the copper. So not only are we at risk of losing our steam, but losing our telephone service and fiber optic as well. So understanding the proximity of these utilities to each other is quite important. You might not know that one of in 5 of the major electricity plants today dates all the way back to the time of Thomas Edison. By the time we hit 1886 in the United States, in New York City, we've already 15,000 electric lamps. This is a picture many of you have seen in the New York Times that was taken before the major snowstorm in the late 1800s. You're seeing lines related to telephone, telegraph, stock tickers, private security alarms, police and fire lines. When this huge winter storm came, all of those utilities were highly vulnerable. And there was a decision made to start burying these. So this was considered an improvement in resiliency by putting these lines underground. There are also completely decommissioned utilities, things like the pneumatic tubes, which you see running not only from the bottom of Manhattan to beyond the top of Central Park, but all the way over to Brooklyn as well. 7 million letters a day. And that piping all still exists underground here. What about our fire and call boxes? These are familiar sites around the city. Originally, there were 15,000 of them. They obviously date far before we had cell phones. Today, there's still over 4,400 in operation. Unfortunately, they represent less than 3% of the emergency calls, but 88% of the false reports. We think about utilities as something that are fairly static, water, sewage. But here we saw on the left, pay telephone. Almost a year ago, New York decommissioned their last pay telephones. So what happened to these telephones? Well, obviously on top, they were removed, but on bottom, all of that wiring remained. In many places, they were repurposed into the Link NYC system, but not all. So you'll see on the left where all the pay telephones were, and on the right, where all the Link NYC is. There's not a one-to-one correspondence, and many neighborhoods don't have that many. This is problematic because now these are often paved over and lost to local knowledge, that the communities that they reside in, when talking to Link NYC and requesting service, the response back is, well, we don't know exactly where these payphones were, so it's hard for us to cost effectively come into your community. We think of this, again, as something that happened in the past. But what about gas stations? There used to be quite a few. Even in my living in New York City, the last 10 years, we have lost one of the few remaining gas stations below Central Park, down on Houston Street. The top remnants of this thing is gone, but below there are always these utility tanks and lines. Not only do they pose a challenge when we go to renew our city, put in new infrastructure, but they also cause an environmental hazard. I know everyone on the call is very interested in transportation. So here's a wonderful old map of Brooklyn, our trolley map here, 600 miles of trolley track. Where is it? The last trolley ran in New York in, I think, 1954, 58. But that track mostly is still in the ground, generally paved over. And even if the track is gone, the ballasts, or the ties that you're seeing here underneath are still in the streets. Similarly, on the left-hand side, you see an elevated train line. And in the right portion, you see construction happening for the subway. When the subway was finished and the Ls were all taken down, only the above ground parts were decommissioned. What happened to all of the foundations that supported those trains? We also know that many subway stations themselves are actually abandoned. There's at least 9 that New York City has stopped using, including the one for our wonderful transit museum. And an equal number of active stations have unused platforms. Our underground pipes and tubes were also used to transport animals. So the cows were brought up from Texas to the Chicago area, loaded onto trains, shipped live to New York to the meat markets on the west side. 12th Avenue already existed to get the cows from off the cattle cars and to the meat markets. there is at least one 200-foot long tunnel that we know of underneath there. The one on the left, the drawings on the left, is a second one that exists in Staten Island. So there's lots of surprising things beneath our feet. I think the key takeaway is that when technologies get abandoned and forgotten, it's very easy to quickly lose track of the remnants that they leave behind. So how do we start dealing with this, and why is it important? If we look at where we are today in terms of modern utilities in New York City, many of them have finally moved to digitization. Some of them are even digitized to the New York City base map, but there's not a lot of sharing going on. So how do we start to overcome that?
Thank you. So last month, we were lucky to have our collaborators from Ireland come join us to collect some data down in Sunset Park. As part of that, we also collected data at the Transit Museum, as you can see on the video on the right. And I'll just take a moment to explain what you're seeing. This is a handheld laser scanning device called a GeoSLAM. And you can see kind of the process of using it. You need to start it at one point on the ground. You can walk on your route, and you can scan everything around you, including lower areas. And we use this machine that was brought with one of our colleagues from Ireland. It's an inexpensive device. It's about $25,000, and it's easy relatively to carry with you and to really walk in areas and create these 3D model scans. And then we had also, our other collaborator that brought his more of a stationary scanning device. And so what you see now on your screen is actually a very high resolution scan of the Transit Museum. It's important to know that this is not a video. This is me walking through different shots. And each time that you see this white circle, for example, the one you saw before on the ground, that is where the scanner was placed. And so I just went through and I clicked to go through each image on the screen. So you can see we started from the ground level and then we went downstairs, and whoever's been there, it should look familiar to you, and whoever hasn't, this is a sneak peek. And so here we kind of went through all the turnstiles and everything all the way down. And at this point, what we're showing is the image version. So what's important to note with laser scanning is that you collect the cloud point, the one that you saw at the beginning when Professor Leifer presented, and then on top of it, you can lay an image, and that's what gives it color. And so you will see soon when I transfer into a 3D version of the image, you can see all the little points, and each of them is colored to create this colored image as well. And so this is us on the platform level, just kind of scanning around, and then in just a moment you will see the 3D version. So it's a bit more buggy. It's a bit harder for my computer to load it, but I just chose a place on the ground and zoomed in, and just in a moment you will see the different points as part of the point cloud. So yes, again, these are all these millions and millions of points that connect together to create this 3D model that really allows us to move through the space, even from the comfort of our home, and kind of see the details that we would see if we were there. All right, and this is from the previous device that we saw, the handheld device, the GeoSLAM. It does also connect the point cloud, as well as this device that we just discussed. And what you can see here is the model with the layers of height. So we can see on the bottom, we have the blue, the lowest level, and then we have all the way to the red, which is the highest level. And I don't know if you can identify this, but this is also just outside the Transit Museum. And so what can we really do with this?
So why would we want to understand what lies beneath our feet? Well, first, to get an appreciation of how much space, how much volume is being taken up. So when we look at this kind of what it might appear as a cut through for you, but is actually just a look at the 3D model, you see from the left side of the screen all the way to the right side, this is the publicly accessible areas of the Transit Museum. So it goes, that entirety along the bottom is actually the train station platform. And you can see in the top right, the right-hand side, your connection with those stairs that Kim walked you down to the street level. Well, what does this mean? And why do what does having an understanding of this kind of volumetric occupation of the subsurface play a part in our modern lives? Well, one, we could think about how important it is if we're going to start reusing subsurface spaces for different activities. We want to put in better and new utilities. We want to put in maybe another subway line. Well, if something's already there, it's going to be very difficult and expensive. But there are other applications as well. And our partners in Ireland on that project, we've been looking about how to take information like this and come up with volumetric estimates of where water might go during a flooding event. So we see here on the left, and this is a picture of Belfast, the end of a simulation for flooding. On the left-hand side are the estimated areas and depth of floodwaters without consideration of basement spaces. On the right-hand side, it's the same analysis, but using a volumetric sink at each location where we were able to establish a basement. Well, what does this mean? Well, obviously, you can see on the right-hand side, there looks to be less flooding, and it looks to be less severe. So there's less of that red. So we say, okay, fine, great. The flood predictions are wrong, that it's not going to be as bad. Well, so why do we care? Well, one, if we do messaging to people and tell them to evacuate, and then it's not so bad, the next time we need them to evacuate, they won't. But it's more complicated and more beneficial than that. If you think about being able to understand the timing of a flood like this with much more precision, you're able to deploy limited municipal resources at the places where you need them most. So if you know that an area has a lot of stuff underground where that water is likely to go, and maybe that's an area of the city that's not going to flood as fast as some blocks nearby. So if you're thinking about doing things like staged evacuations, which are obviously necessary in urban areas where you can't get 9.1 million people across, 6 bridges out of Manhattan within a reasonable amount of time, understanding exactly where this flooding is going to happen is quite critical. It's also important in terms of risk communication. So here we've taken that same technology, that colorized laser scan, and now we've coupled it with another technology where we've put this with something called a flood filling scenario, and we're able to do an animation to actually show the flood waters of this area. So we can go to somebody's work, their home, their school, do a scan of the local environment, pair it with the predictions for flood from different hurricanes, and show people locally how that flood water is going to look. I can tell you that the work we've done so far shows that 100% of people believe that seeing things like this is much more effective in educating them than showing a National Weather Service map and just telling them through text to evacuate. When you see your car halfway filled with water, you start to get concerned. And we're hoping that by showing people things like this, we can motivate people to make better flood preparedness, maybe talk to their landlords about putting in sump pumps, and to also convey to people some of the importance with this. What's interesting here is that one of our partners, the Newtown Creek Alliance, was helping us with this in terms because they do a lot of work on flood risk communication and kind of what it means to live close to waterways. And they said that they have a real problem that people think floodwaters are clean, and they go out and they play in them, and they're often filled with sewage because that's what's happening as your sewers are backing up. And so what we did in this is that at the beginning of the simulation, the water looks blue. And when it gets to the point where the sewers can no longer handle the rain flow, the simulation starts to turn darker and darker gray as a way to indicate to people that the water's really not so clean. But risk communication is only part of it. I think there's a larger role about educating people about the utilities that they rely upon and that they live near every day.
Yes, so as part of our project, we are partnering with the Chinese American Planning Council in Sunset Park. And our goal was really to share our project and also teach the community about the underground. And so what you see on the screen at this point is games that I developed together with a team of local high school students that we worked together throughout the past year. On the left is an underground Jeopardy game. And what we did is we created these simple questions of understanding what really exists in the underground, because maybe we are aware that the underground exists, and specifically in New York, where we take the subway a lot and all that, we have interaction with the underground, but we don't really necessarily think or know what exists in it. And so another game that we did was the underground bingo on the top right, which has different elements of the underground. And what we really wanted to show the community is there's all these things that maybe we don't think about, that it's pretty important to know. And you can see on the bottom, we have our students presenting to members of the community. And so one of the things that was really interesting throughout this process with working with the students and the community was that one of our students said that she was very interested to work on the project because she really wanted to learn where the electricity comes from. So there's these questions of really unawareness and knowledge that can be gained through just, simple education experiences.
So I thought that the question of where does the electricity come from was an interesting one, because it, I think, highlights for us that underground utilities pose two sets of vulnerabilities. The one on the left, I think we're all fairly aware of, where what I call proximal, where you have things that are buried usually in the same ditch, so in direct burial, and they're next to each other. So if there's a compromise on one, there's an explosion or there's a leak or something, it may very well compromise all of the utilities that are in this area. The one I think that we think less about in terms of vulnerabilities is the spatial extent, that these systems are connected. If we think about the subway, when one subway station floods, it tends to flood much of the rest of the line. So you may have a low-lying area in one place, but that water travels. This analogy is the same for all of our other utilities. We only have so many electrical substations. We only have so many places where sewage is processed, as well as the energy produced. So when we think about energy coming into the city, sewage going out of the city, all of these are systems. And often things that can happen in one part of that system can have terrible effects on other parts. Probably the most stark example of the criticality of having an appreciation of what is underground happened right after 9/11. Many people understand and know that New York City's Office of Emergency Management's GIS center, where they did all the mapping, was actually destroyed during that attack. It was in the basement of one of the buildings. And so people from all across New York and beyond came together in the days and weeks afterwards, trying to pull together as many maps and knowledge that various people had in their back pockets, in their mind, in books and maps, and to bring it together and to create maps and maps and maps for all the first responders, all the people who were trying to clear the debris. Thousands of maps were generated over about 3 weeks. And luckily, as part of that, somebody came into the center with a map that showed this thing that we're looking at on the right-hand side, which is a 20,000-gallon Freon tank. This Freon tank ran the air conditioning system for the World Trade Center. But what most people don't know is that when Freon is heated, it can become extremely poisonous, basically the equivalent of mustard gas. And what the team was able to establish at that time was that the fires were relatively close to this tank, But by having this information and working with the first responders, there was a coordinated effort to make sure that the fires never got close to this tank, because should it have exploded, there's a good chance of poisoning about 2.3 million people in Lower Manhattan and Southwest Brooklyn. So I will leave you with that thought. And I want to kind of emphasize the point that this has been really a 20-year struggle, that lots of people have been involved with really trying to move that needle. And it's been a hard road because there are dozens of data owners and some of them don't have complete data. Some of it's not even digitized. There's obviously some security and privacy concerns. But at the bottom of it has really mostly been lack of money and lack of integrated leadership. So we're delighted that we've been able to partner with Mayor Adams on this project. Our goal was to kind of bring all these organizations together, get them to sit down and talk to each other, some of them for the very first time, talk about the criticality of having not only full digitization of their data, but immediate interoperability. And what we're not talking about everybody turning their data over to the mayor's office. We're talking about Con Ed keeping their data, Verizon keeping their data, National Grid keeping their data. So they're keeping it up to date, but that they're keeping it in a data format that can be readily exchanged and integrated, so that we're not spending days or weeks after an emergency, that we're only required to wait minutes or maybe a few hours. So I'd like to thank our team, particularly I want to call out Wendy Dorf and Al Leidner, who have been at this struggle on the ground really long before the World Trade Center incident. So I also wanted to just mention that we have a couple of upcoming events if people would like to attend. One is at the top, a utility inspection school. This is being co-hosted with Purdue University and the American Society of Civil Engineers through the utility branch. There is a cost for that, but it's an excellent program. And then we are having a free event at the end of that week on May 19th, Friday, May 19th, where really some of the state of the art in detecting some of these utilities and how to store this data will be featured. It's a day-long event and anyone's welcome to come along, but you do need to pre-register. So thank you very much.
That was great. That was so interesting. We do have a few questions in the chat. I have a few of my own, but if you came in late and have a question, please put it in the chat and I'll share it out with Deborah and Kim. But I wanted to ask if I feel like this problem would be a problem shared by many other cities, especially cities like I think of Rome, where it takes them like 20 years to do 10 feet of subway because they keep coming across ancient artifacts. So is there other models in other cities of data visualization and sharing that you've looked at? Or
yeah, so probably the first one of note came out of Japan in the 1980s. And because in the United States, there were literally millions of what they call utility strikes, where somebody excavates and they hit a utility and they damage it. And unfortunately, sometimes people die because of this, but often the community loses power, they lose telephone access or other problems. And there was a group from the United States that went over to Japan and learned all about the things that they were doing. And they came back and they set up this thing called 811 or One Dig, or some of you may know it as Julie, in the 90s. And the idea was that if you were going to do construction in an area, you would call this number and this agency or organization would have all of this information for the live utilities, and either they would give it to you or they would organize it so somebody would come out and mark them on the ground. And it has helped, but we still had, I think in last year, over 300,000 utility strikes in the United States. And part of it's because these 811, these local 811 systems don't have all the data. So for example, in New York City, the Department of Environmental Protection, who handles not only the water, but the sewage system, does not participate in 811. So it's very hard to keep people and communities safe when there's not full cooperation. But I think when we think about these systems, there's a lot more that can be done if this data was made available in an appropriate way. So as an example, our community partner, the Community Board 7, Sunset Park, when we went to talk to them, Jeremy Loeffler said, gosh, I'd love to have something like this, because we had an incident come up where we had a new park that was built in the neighborhood. I think this goes back a few years now, and they wanted to put in a bathroom in the park. And they went to the city, and as part of the capital program, they said, oh, we want a bathroom here. And the city came back and they said, oh, well, there's no sewage or water lines near there. It's a big park. And that was the end of the discussion. And had the community board been given even schematics of where these sewer and water lines are, there's a good chance that they could have advocated better for themselves at that time. And there's dozens of other use cases that we can talk about, including one that was highlighted by the fire department. So the fire department does not even have access to all of these. And when we spoke to the head of GIS, the fire department, he said, oh, I would love to have this, because when we have a big, like 3 or 4 alarm fire, we send multiple trucks out to the site. And what I don't, and many of them are parked a block or 2 away, you know, because they're going to come in and relieve the crew that's on site. And what we don't want to do is to be parking these fire units on top of gas lines that might explode. And if we knew which gas lines were connected where, we would be able to do this more safely. So we have examples of other countries really taking a better lead on this. In the UK, there's a huge investment recently in the National Underground Asset Registry, and they're doing the entire country. Canada has now committed to this at a nationwide level, and so has Australia. And there's quite a few other countries and municipalities that have various versions of this, some more in-depth than others. The Chicago Transit Authority has a pretty good one, quite a good model. But in all of these, there's no consideration for what they call decommissioned utilities, which is what we spent a bit of time today looking at. And there's no consideration of natural features that may also pose problems. So I hope that answered the question, Amy.
Yeah, for sure. We did get a request to go back to your slide to get information about your upcoming programs. If you want to go back to that while we continue to talk.
Yeah, we can just leave that up if that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's fine. So we did have you did touch on the issue of security and privacy as some of the barriers in centralizing this information, but someone asked specifically, I forget what it's called. They called it a gizmo. It was the camera that cost 25 grand. But just the fact that it could pick up images so quickly and accurately, I think not just for privacy, but also for security. Is there any legal concerns or protections in place from nefarious uses?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the security point of view, if you talk to the MTA, who's actually one of our partners, they will tell you what they're not so concerned about things like what we showed you. They're much more concerned about access hatches, parallel tunnels, service tunnels, things like that. They know that anybody with a cell phone could go through, you know, and videotape things, and with some work, you know, generate a 3D model from that. Privacy in the city of New York, if you were on the street and somebody takes your photo or somebody takes a video of you, this is completely legal.
As you mentioned, you partnered with the MTA. Has any of this technology been used in current transit development at all? No,
but obviously we're working with them and we're talking to them, and they're very interested in understanding how to find some of these things and how to maybe do a better job maintaining current assets. But to go back to the security issue, I mean, when we proposed this project, we knew that this was going to be probably #1 hot button. And we work very hard to make sure that all of our workflows follow the workflows that are already in place in the city. So right now, if there's a steam explosion, as for example, the big one that happened in 2017 on the Upper West Side, what happens at that point? Well, besides people bringing physical maps out to the site, a certain amount of data goes from the utility providers to the Office of Emergency Management. So there's a set of protocols to do that. The problem is that they're not all registered to the same base map. The data scales are not all compatible, and the data types are not compatible. So one of the things that our group has done is we worked heavily with an organization called OGC, the Open Geospatial Consortium, to help in the development of what we call a data exchange model that's referred to as MUDDI. And the idea is that MUDDI now provides a opportunity for fairly interoperable data exchange between many different data storage systems and data types that are used for underground utilities. And the idea is that that will then be extended to incorporate geological features and hydrogeological features so that you have a full picture of what's happening underground.
So it seems like from your partners, they all kind of, I mean, there is a siloed effect, and it's interesting to think about what where it should be combined and how it should be combined and how the data should be integrated. But we did have a question about what you said, the two things that you're interested about is the underground structures really that are no longer in use. And who do you think, like how and where would that kind of data be kept, especially since it doesn't necessarily have a overarching organization that would necessarily fall under their jurisdiction or domain. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So we're doing a couple things. One, we're taking all of the old fire insurance maps, things that are often referred to as Sanborn maps, but there's about 4 or 5 companies that actually produce them. And they've been digitized by the New York Public Library at a very high resolution, but they've not been what we call rubber sheeted to a base map. So we are doing that so that you can look at those and the base maps and to take other historic maps that we know of, like the ones of the pneumatic mail that I showed, like the ones of the trolley lines, and to also digitize those so that there is a common open resource. It's not going to be perfect, but it'll be a lot better than what we have right now, and it will be easily accessible. And as people build utilities, hopefully what happens is that more of it gets recorded, and it gets recorded at a data quality level that's much higher than has been done before. So for instance, the New York Fire Department, which you would not think is a utility owner, actually is in charge of all those fire boxes. So they are in charge of not only the maintenance of the units, but all the wiring related to them. They know which intersection all these fireboxes are at, but they do not know the exact location. So, to just go back on one more issue on the security, I think in some ways that cow has left the barn. With all the stuff that people can do now with machine learning and high resolution imagery. I mean, if you looked down your street, you would probably see a batch of light poles. You would probably see a batch of fire hydrants. And if we connect them together just from the above ground stuff, you know, from what we see or open data maps, we know that they're for the higher fire hydrants, that there's a high pressure clean water line underneath that. So there's a lot of things that we can infer. Now, we don't know exactly the size, we don't know the capacity, and we don't know that what they call that Z elevation, the depth. But pulling the privacy card, pulling, you know, the security card, we believe that for many organizations prior to COVID, it was an excuse not to share data that they felt was incomplete and possibly incorrect. And what we've seen over the last few years is huge investments, particularly on the part of National Grid and Con Ed, to digitize their data. And I think there's maybe less concern of showing things when you have more confidence in your data. But I will mention the fact that the data that they are sharing does not come to NYU. It goes directly to the Office of Emergency Management and is only handled through trusted agents. We are in many ways the facilitator of this effort, but we're delighted to, to acknowledge the fact that that New York City has gone out and gotten itself a $10 million federal grant to extend our work and has selected a site up in Queens to do that. So if you're more interested in that, or want to hear more about it, definitely come to our workshop on May the 19th.
Okay, so I have 2 more questions, but please feel free to we still have time if anyone else wants to add them to the chat. So you'd mentioned Con Edison a few times, and someone asked maybe for more details about your coordination with them on critical utilities, or if there's any evolution over the decades of this work that has made any progress.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we got Con Edison to sit down in the same room with National Grid, MTA, Verizon, and DEP for the first time ever, and had that happen on multiple occasions, I think is major progress. If you look to the emergency response community, what they say, and have said for decades, is you don't want to be exchanging business cards at the site of the disaster. The first thing in terms of building trust is to know who your partners are, who your competitors are. And we've been working with these groups, doing focus groups, doing surveys, and some really interesting things have come out that most of these organizations feel like they know where their assets are, but they know they're in direct burial conditions with other assets, and they have no idea who else is in the same ditch with them. And this is a major concern. Also, when we surveyed them on what their major concern was from a utility perspective in terms of outage, 100% response, telecommunications. The feeling is if telecommunications goes out during an emergency, everything else is going to stop. So all these organizations have a vested interest in playing nicely with our telecommunications companies like Verizon.
Great. And then I think we have one more question, which is really interesting. In the future, how might we build utilities to record the locations with live accuracy, or would that even be useful? So for example, when new utilities are placed underground, it might shift old utilities, and even a meter could create risk. So I think this kind of live accuracy is kind of the kernel of this question.
And it's a good question because we know that those telecommunications lines that we saw on the top of our excavation pit in the first slide or two, they're very thin, they're very flexible. And one day they may be on one side of the trench, and then an excavation happens, and the next thing they're actually on the other side of the trench. And we know that this happens. So there is something called a utilidor. So utilidor, you can think of as a corridor for utilities. And the idea is that you put these into these giant concrete culverts where they're dry, they're accessible. You don't have to dig up the street to get to them. You can put instrumentation directly on them, so you can do intervention earlier. And we all know that anytime you can do intervention earlier, it ends up being cheaper. So you better asset management. But in New York City, these things are challenging. And there was an effort on the part of Port Authority to actually install a fairly large one as part of a new construction system over on the west side. And what they ran into was not only, the fact that we have all these kind of old, what they call franchise agreements, which gives the utilities a lot of power, but there's legal issues that, who's responsible, for the culvert, who is liable if something goes wrong. And in the United States, where these assets are owned not only by different organizations, some public, some private, some city, some state, this becomes complicated. We have great examples of utilidors being used as early as the 19th century in Paris and London, to greater extents or lesser extents. There's some good examples in Madrid, but in all those cases, the government owns all the utilities, which makes things much easier.
Interesting. I mean, someone just asked right while you're talking about utility tunnels, and I'm kind of assuming that's the same as utility doors or utility corridors that you were just talking about. But correct me if I'm wrong, if that's something different.
I've never heard it called that, but I would imagine that's what they're speaking about. You know, we dig up the streets in New York City over 100,000 times every year. I mean, this is crazy. And if you could imagine in the public right of way that instead of digging, that there's a tunnel, and you can walk. You know, there's a few places you can enter it, you can walk to it, and there's some other places where you can bring in large equipment. It seems to make a lot of sense. These things are not cheap, but the idea is if you start building them in places where there's a lot of utility density, and in places where you're already doing major construction, say at Hudson Yards or other, you know, major construction sites, we can start advancing this so that we don't have to continue to live in the dirt.
Yeah. Oh, he just Wikipedia what a utility tunnel is. Take a look at that. I think I also just have a random question that came to mind about property ownership and land rights, and how deep does that go? How much more does that complicate things in trying to look underground when you're looking?
Yeah, a lot. In the United States, in most jurisdictions, property owners own that property to the center of the earth.
Oh my goodness.
This
Okay.
is very different than in many other countries. So often we are restricted to the public right of way, but we don't make a very good use of it. And the public right of way is usually from sidewalk to sidewalk. So sidewalk all the way across the street to the other edge of the sidewalk. And that's where you're going to find most of our utilities today. Is either under the sidewalks or in the, you know, down the middle of the street. Walk down the street and take a look, and you will be amazed how many manholes of all sorts of different kinds you can see in a single block.
That sounds like a great way to spend an afternoon. That would be a fun scavenger hunt. Anyway, I think that there's no more questions rolling in, so I'll just kind of wrap things up. I want to thank you both again for joining us. That was really, really interesting. And I thank you all for coming today and staying through the questions and answers. Again, I want to put some links into the chat for if you can come to the museum and visit. Also, if you enjoyed the program, please consider making a donation or becoming a member to help keep our programs going and free. And we hope you join us for our next virtual event, which you can find on our website as well. It's next Thursday at 6 p.m. and it'll be presented by yours truly on women artists in the subway system to celebrate Women's History Month. So I hope to see you guys then. And we'd also like to thank our sponsor, Con Ed, for supporting our virtual programs. And I hope everyone has a great evening.
So we'll sign off from our stairwell. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, Deborah.